Well, thanks, Miro. I'm very happy to be here in your studio for the first time. And it was a delight to see your projects. I really enjoyed the day very much. I prepared a lecture which is at the same time a bit of a preparation for my summer plans. So it's a kind of a bouquet of topics or aspects that I want to think about over the summer and to develop. It's basically an interest in how to relate to perfection and to luxury in a way that would somehow be digital. No? And when you told me that your semester topic is flowers, I remembered that a long time ago, almost more like 20 years ago, I tried to write. I was totally into Luce at that time. I loved the rhizome and this idea of making connections, and I was asking how can things bloom if this rhizomatic kind of joining forces in a kind of a symbiosis, which is not really a symbiosis, could work. And I came up there with the term of genitality that I got very interested, because it's between the sexness, the reproduction, the genderness, and genealogies as well. And I tried to somehow find a way to address what this topic could mean in an intellectual sense, no? And I did not succeed at all. I wrote a paper I gave at the Deleuze conference, and I don't even remember it, but it had to do with the flowers. So my point was to say, what if because flowers are expenditure, no? So they have something luxurious, so we cannot get the flower. I mean, of course, we can make up functional stories about the flower, no? We can, like the wasp and the orchid, and it's a co-evolution, which just on a higher level, where the symbiosis creates still again of a functional kind of systematicity, but that doesn't capture the quality I was interested in with the flowers. And there is still something, and that's what I came back now through your invitation as well, maybe, no, to address, so then today it would be more, so the flower would become an image for an object's genitality. No? So if the objects among objects in such an object-centric term still wants to capture subjective relations, my interest is how not to totalize the subjective. No? Because in my understanding, a lot of the interest in object-oriented ontology, realism, and so on, are totally are an idealistic stance ultimately, no? Which remain within the mental mindset of a mentality. And I'm interested: can there not be a kind of a flowering or a fauna or a speciation within such an if you want, an ideality that would not put the individual cogito, the individual thinking subject, or a collective of it, so central. And the term genital simply means everything that pertains to sexual reproduction. And I started to read now Luce Irigaray. This is a feminist thinker who was writing a lot in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and now has a new kind of cycle of books in the 2000s, where she begins to talk about the sexedness of nature through bringing the elements, so fire, water, earth, and air, back into play. So it's a sexedness which is not social, it's not in that sense an idealism, but it's attending to an atmospheric, a climatic nature that is not just passive but active, and how to capture this activity. So these are a bit the coordinates of the things I would like to talk about, because it would then mean sexual is not just an adjective, so of the how-to of this reproduction, but more like an elementality. So if the elements, which always are in a proportion, no? That's the beauty in the old, in the antique notion of the elements, fire, water, earth, and air, is that they form a proportionality. So fire is to earth like water is to air. No? A is to B like C is to D. 4 things. None of these 4 things can be something alone, so they're not autonomous, and yet they are distributed these distributed bodies that are not alone organized. So they are universal in the sense that there is nothing at all that is not made up of all four of those elements. So it's a play of how to think wholeness, not as a unity that could be represented, but wholeness. No? And how can one relate to wholeness without representing it? Because then, of course, we always already fail. And that is the starting point of Luce Irigaray. So she puts things central for her approach, which are quite surprising, but in a way also very evident. So she speaks of pleasure rather than desire, for example, which is quite rare among the feminist discourses, because she says pleasure cannot be shared. One can participate in the pleasure of another, but pleasure cannot be shared. Whereas desire always crystallizes around an object, no? That one wants to have, or melt with, or identify with. So this relation of something that allows for co-participation, and yet it cannot be shared. So it cannot be partitioned, it cannot be distributed, it cannot be managed, it cannot be shared. So this is her approach then to rethink the notion of sex as being not one. No? So the sex that is not one was one of her founding books, and it's a very abstract thought that needs a lot of, for me at least, doping with things that kind of lie in the air and might play a role for her or not. I am not that much concerned with whether I now represent to you Luce Irigaray as Luce Irigaray. So I'm not working that much in discourses where one would try to give an overview of the discursive territories or communities. But it's fostering these ideas. And she has another book which is called, and it's part of this recent cycle, it's called Elemental Passions. And this thought for the abstraction that is involved with coding literacy, because coding literacy is a kind of a literacy which is pre-specific to the form that is being encoded. So coding literacy would mean you try to translate the text, but you don't know the original language. Yeah, you can only guess. So the original text is not the reference. You need to puzzle out what the original text means in order to then translate it into another language. So code is not with signification. And her term with speaking of elemental passions seems to address something like that, because the elements in the metaphysical and the pre-Socratic treatises, they always featured in terms of their activities. So the elements would basically be involved in processes of rarefaction, they were called rarefaction, and concentration. So a drawing together and a concentration, or a rarefaction, which is a kind of a percolation and a getting rare. No? So and through these processes, they would describe how, for example, one can explain why the water in the seas is salty, while the rainwater is not salty, while there is a whole one cycle of the water of the earth. No? So it's the same water, and yet in the sea it is salty, and in the rain cycles it's not. So that's where these processes of concentration and rarefaction, so Verdünnung oder Ausdünnung und Konzentrierung of all sorts of minerals and Stofflichkeiten, which gets distributed through these percolative filters, so percolation filters. So they were trying to explain rainbows like this, or the forms of snowflakes like this, and all these natural phenomena. And the study of this is where the term meteora, that's where we took it from, no? From antiquity, because every philosopher was writing on meteorology, except it was not yet called meteorology. But it would address these phenomena which you can not objectively grasp, even though they are clearly real, but they're transitory. No? They're transitory, and they kind of crystallize within a scope of minima and maxima, where the minima and the maxima would be a bit like black and white, and the reality is all the colors of it. So, the elemental passions and the blooming. Maybe I leave for now the further twist with a room of one's own. Maybe I can come back for it later. Or no, actually, I don't need to explain. A Room of One's Own was one of the very important and really most beautiful texts by Virginia Woolf on the question of women writers. And she has one concept there which was picked up by Michel Serres. In a whole book, it's the concept of the incandescent. So what she was arguing is that these women writers, they are not that much different from the male writers because the mind, as she characterizes it, is androgynous. And this androgynousness then bears the question, well, how are differences and distinctions preserved? And the way that she was thinking about this is through this notion of the incandescent, of which she writes, I have a passage here, she writes, Coleridge, so he seems to have been talking about the incandescent as well, I don't know about that. Coleridge certainly did not mean when he said that a great mind is androgynous, that it is a mind that has any special sympathy with women, a mind that takes up their cause or devotes itself to their interpretation. Perhaps the androgynous mind is less apt to make these distinctions than the single-sexed mind. He meant perhaps that the androgynous mind is resonant and porous, that it transmits emotions without impediment, that it is naturally creative, incandescent, and undivided. So it's you can see how through the incandescent there is again this kind of meteoric percolation, but now introduced into the domain of idealism, so of subject-centric philosophies. And Michel Serres, who he recently died, a French philosopher from whom I learned a lot, had one of his last books devoted to the figure, in his case it's a figure, the incandescent, so the one who is incandescent. And there is a central dynamics that I'm trying to think through since I encountered this book, which is about a play not only of memory but of forgetting. So, and this memory and the forgetting, that's a bit what I want to think in, or why the gesture of Irigaray is interesting to me, to say the elements have passions. So then the passions of the elements would be like the forgetting, whereas the activity of the elements would be like the memory, so that which can be memorized and that which can be forgotten. So it's a kind of you can think of it as a spiral where the path can go, always where you go up, you can also go down. So it's a forgetting and a memory which is, of which we are not in control, but which also just doesn't take over. No? So there is a participatory relation to both of these things, while both of these things cannot be shared. We cannot share the forgetting with somebody, and we can also not share the memory with somebody. It's not the memory that we share, it is the way we tell tales, the way we keep memories, the way we organize them. But the experience that is alive when we like to dwell in our memories, we cannot share. So the interest with this whole thing is a bit to say, is there not another way to think in philosophy that wouldn't have to totalize one of the two poles, the object-centric or the subject-centric, no? Or play one at the expense of the other, because one can get distinctions and its clarity if it basically makes a straw man of the other pole, and this goes mutually and it makes for good entertainment, I guess, but it doesn't really help. So the book by Michel Serres brings in this notion. It begins with the chapter Memory and Forgetfulness. In its terms, he discusses what he calls the grand narrative. And the grand narrative, so most of you will know, no? The one document that introduced postmodernism was to say it's the end of the grand narrative. So there can no longer be great stories that would produce unification or a kind of a symbolization that would become, that would acquire the force of an ideology that can really impregnate a certain age. It's the end of that. The way that he means it is through nature, not through culture. So what he calls the grand story begins literally in a molecular, in a chemical, in a physical way, and includes, so basically, to make it very short, the grand story is written in the DNA of everything that is alive. No? And the DNA, and that's the level of the coding and the life, the DNA literally bears the traces of everything that has ever lived. The DNA of all of us individually. Yeah? So the story, how the newspapers relate to how we are genetically determined, no? Like predisposed to become a smoker or to become this or that, conveys really a totally inadequate image of what DNA does, because it's a storehouse of universal plenty of possibilities, out of which, in ways that we can't, nobody can really grasp this yet, certain specificity profiles and shows up. So what DNA overfloods us with possibilities. It's quite the opposite from determining us to become one particular thing. So that's the way he addresses it, and he says then there is, so when we want to relate now to life as such, without trying to say, can we objectify it, and then do we go to a mechanistic view, or do we need to subjectify it, and are we then evoking new gods and making new religions? He says, well, there is a kind of a storehouse of the grand narrative, which life itself has written, stored in the DNA, and which we cannot read. And yet, we can. No? We can learn to read. So this idea with the translating an original which we cannot decipher yet. So that is the context of his approach, and of course the relation to this level of addressing code and life through code is especially interesting because the way we can model it is through information theory. So information theory, which no longer becomes a tool, a technology to master or manage or control or exploit or exhaust or correct nature as its opposite, but nature itself is, the way that our science today accounts for nature is through information and through information theory. So information counts as a quantity, which is stofflich, no? It's like a magnitude. But there's no measure. There's no particular measure. So it's eine Maßlosig. So it's a quantity which dwells in a scalelessness. So in eine Maß, also eine Quantität, dessen Maßstab beliebiges sein kann. So that's how he addresses information. And this is also why this kind of daring, no, you could say, or what should it be useful for? Isn't it much too abstract to lend itself for anything useful or pragmatic? But it's a scope which might actually help us really to accommodate these floods that we are experiencing with artificial intelligence, with the impasse of saying there is an intelligence which is natural, we claim it's ours, but then we don't want to think anthropocentric, so we do whatever with this paradox, versus one that is technological and that is supposed to duplicate ours. So we can get out of this paradigm and just say, okay, intelligent. We also don't understand our intelligence, no. So why claim that there's a second nature to it or a second kind of it? Why not just begin to say again, like with life, that manifests in code, intelligence manifests in cultures, in the plural, and we do understand a lot of it, but not really. Yeah? So it's a different world then, where there can be a relation to the arcane, or to that which is mysterious, or which is not well grasped, that doesn't directly lead to the building of a religion. That's basically the problem, or that's the beauty I see in it. No? So we need to find ways to address to secrecy, and secrecy, literally in its material sense, also means this percolation. So to secrete, no? Means to form as a new conglomerate of stoffliche Mischungen, of mixtures that are elemental. So to gain a different philosophical approach or framework to think about these things, this is also how the book develops the nature and culture, its relation to metaphysics, and a rehabilitation, that's what he proposes, of the notion of the universal. And that's where the incandescent really links the works of Irigaray, also Virginia Woolf, with her androgynous mind. So she wants a cogito which can be anything. No? So where the it wouldn't be the neutral in the sense of a kind of a default that is not yet equipped, but more in the sense of a DNA. It can be anything. It's neutral because it's not yet articulated in proportion to an environment. So the androgynous mind would be a kind of a neutrality that is not void of decisions, but pregnant with all kinds of possible decisions. And this I find it a very attractive model to think through, also in relation to the questions of the rainbow spectrum, no, and the queer questions and so on, because it doesn't sacrifice distinctions, but it keeps them separate. Central to it, so with this grand narrative, if you just look at the titles, it's a descent. So it's always think of this spiral that you can ascend and descend. No? So that's how the verticality gets introduced, and where it doesn't necessarily get into a religious or a theological frame set. So it's an affirmation of a verticality, but it's not a verticality where you become more and more divine. It's where you get empowered in the abstraction capacities that you have, and can go down as well. So you can temper the adequacy of the means with which you approach a certain problem, depending on the scale where you identify the problem. So it's a lot about rethinking the relation between time and space. And in Michel Serres, he begins to speak of these little balconies of space-time. And that took me a long time to form some kind of imagination of what that could be, how to think of that. Little balconies of space-time. It has to do, of course, with the plateaus. So when we are in space-time, it's a kind of a plateau logic, so sedimentation, but then there's always an outlook. So the balcony is not just, it's not a ground, no? It's a ground that is not grounded. So it's a place where we can tread on, but it's not, well, it is stable enough for us, but it's not stable in any absolute sense. So balconies of space-time. Then how to think or how to address such balconies. He gives the image of the rose and the gardener. So what is the relation of tending? How does the gardener tend to the rose? Because the rose is the rose also without the gardener tending to it. But the tending of the gardener to the rose still affects how the rose can grow and bloom and evolve and develop. So there is a relation of caring in the sense of cultivating that does not want to appropriate the object, does not want to master the object in that sense. And again, this is a bit what is behind this interest in thinking elemental passions or a kind of a sexness of nature. He has further images. This is a strong one, the torrent and the Grand Canyon for these plateaus. So it's the story where he paints a landscape where in the mountains there is a little hut where a family is living with a little girl who is playing with a little doll, and then the text zooms in the time relations relative to all of these items which are depicted as being part of the scene. And then explores where are these time relations coming from. And then very, very quickly, it's like a looking glass that goes into this descent into the grand narrative. Very quickly, you have geological ages confounding in the presence of this little girl having her birthday, celebrating the doll her granddad just gave her. So it's this kind of, it's a kind of a scopic or an optical instrument that goes through time in a way that is not linear, no? Because it steps on from balcony to balcony, so to say. Whereas the supporting house is always already gone. So these balconies are a bit like stepping stones. And then the way that he says we can relate to space is through mosaics. through marquetry. So space, we can never be outside of it. But when we are inside of it, we can also not see it. So the way that we can see it is through mosaics that kind of paint the telling of tales of the grand narrative, and form images of time that do not represent a certain event, but are stitched together from telltales, basically. So from legends, from formats that they're not real. They're also not fictitious, so they don't produce a prose, a linear kind of story in which the action is clear. It's more like a web of bringing parts of certain actions or activities into consonance or into resonance with one another. So it's a space of a kind of a constellation quality. And this is how we can link it now to the interest of Luce Irigaray, because for her, and for me this was quite surprising, So she says the sexness of nature pertains to space and time is attached to the male and space to the female. And this comes from the hora in the Timaeus. So the notion of the receptacle, space as a receptacle that can give birth. And that's how she then addresses or thinks about how to address this feminine side. With an interest that doesn't try to save the feminine side or to temper or to control the male one, but simply by asking the question, so it's a symbolical way of putting it, no? Do you want the flower to open only once? So this is when we give an account, a historical account of events. So we try to get its singularity in order to generalize it. But then it's like the flower opens only once. The unveiling of the opening would then belong to you. So this is a path to mastership. The beauty of truth of the opening would be your discovery, proposed and exposed in one definitive blossoming. The nightly closing of the flower, its folding back into itself, would not take place. What she's interested in is how, without bringing light into the night, not where the flower withdraws when it goes back, can we address or talk or take into account this difference between night and day? So the nightly mind is what she addresses as the feminine, which is not yet represented space. It's space, but not general, not representable. So it's an active space. Wouldn't call it a virtual one, it's somehow different. How to address that? And she proposes to introduce a notion of assimilation that would not entail the making same. So assimilation involves mimesis usually, no? So assimilation means we become like. That's where we assimilate to. So we become like, and she says there is another manner of assimilation, and it works through mourning. So, and this goes in relation to the forgetting, no? That was her theme. Because in mourning, every way that one actively relates to it is tempered or inhibited from representing what one mourns. If you imagine to write a speech for the funeral of somebody that you really miss, you will see how difficult it is. You want to keep the memory alive, but as soon as you draw a representation of who that person was, you don't keep it alive, you close it off. No? So that's the kind of realness or of activity. That's the notion of space, as Irigaray is talking about, brings back. So then she says, there is a way how we can think assimilation. So a kind of an approximation of the different things, not through becoming like, not through the play of mimesis, but through sharing an encounter in mourning. So to encounter one another because one respects that one mourns, something which is not there. So it's a forgetting which works through a remembering. So it's this interplay. And what's this place of mourning? So she will then introduce not balconies like Michel Serres, but porticos. So she talks about porticos in such a way that I come to that shortly. But what I find interesting in this proposal is that it promises to allow us to think of attitudes in a reason that cannot exhaustively know the space of its own rationality. No? So that these two things fall apart. So reason and rationality, it's not that one reason grounds rationality or rationality renders reason timeless. That's how the play usually goes. This is just to say that it's like in her words, the male and the feminine, they are not the same. No? But they're not two either. So they don't form a binary duality because they're elemental. And their elementality means that they are made of the same thing, but they cannot be the same. So that's how she brings the place, the elements into play. So how can we think attitudes in a reason that cannot exhaustively know the space of its own rationality, and yet know how to express and to share it? So that's a bit, if you want, the brief of following these kinds of ideas and looking for a thread. And what I was trying to think in a recent text that will come out now before the summer, it's a book which is entitled Technologies of the Accident. So how to think the accidentality together with method. No? Where method, where we don't just say we take serendipity as our path giver. No? Where we basically invert method by saying we don't want to plan a path, we will just go wherever chance tells us. But how to think the two together? And my idea there was to think of pantomime. So to think of a place at the edge of the world. And the edge of the world is everywhere where we no longer know the space of our rationality. So we can do things, but we don't know what it really is that we are doing. So basically everywhere in technology today. So, and at the edge of the world, what do we do there? And then the gesture of pantomime is different than that of the mime, because pantomime means to mime all. Pan is the all. And to mime all produces a kind of a mind that would approximate such androgyny, androgyness. So that was a bit the idea. With the pantomime, and Irigaray doesn't speak of pantomime, but she speaks of a mindset that would dwell in, so that would attend to relations, but it would attend to relations in a way that consummates relations. So this is her participation in something that cannot be shared, that will remain private. But the term consummation, and I just recently realized that it has a totally different etymology from consumption. Even so, it sounds very connected, but it's super interesting. Consumption literally means to break something into parts, such that those parts can no longer be fitted back together to form a whole. That's why consumption produces waste. Can no longer, so the vividness of the elementaricity is killed, no, with the consumption. So it's taken out of the cycles, if you want. Whereas consummation is a term that says, so it literally comes from summing a total of the highest. So it's a process of perfection where that which is being perfected is elemental. So it's relations of these things that play together, but you cannot perfect one of them, or one part could also not pursue a perfection unless it is in this constellation of the relations which are cultivated not in order to stabilize or to turn into an infrastructure or to open a capital plateau, no, like in the social media, but it involves a kind of an exhaustion and a striving in mutual dependency for something which in the end will be for one alone, but it would not be possible alone. So that's the beauty of the term. The way I never used that term, and it was actually Ricardo who kept talking about this formulation. I'm not Catholic. In the Catholic Church, no, that marriage is the consummation of marriage. Why this act after the wedding is so important. And it's a processual thinking which never stops and never ends. So it's not a process, because it is related to several, so to networks in their vividness that involve us bodily, spiritually, and in a certain kind sexually, no? And also reproductively, but not biologically reproductively only. So, and this is again where the flower comes in. And what I try, so this is the book I want to write in the summer or to finish, but I didn't have this orientation last summer when I started. But there is this beautiful term for luxuration, no? Because there's always, so when one loves today abstract thoughts, like the people I'm talking to you about, when one likes this, it is so offending to a lot of people because it seems so elitist. No, who in the end will care about these things? What is it good for? Why would one do that? So I was shocked when I looked up my Scopus, so this index system for scholarly work. And then from the articles that I had published, there comes an automatic kind of profiling of the person who thinks. And I was profiled as being decadent, luxurious, elitist, interested in design, and I don't know, all sorts of things, which as a profile, I mean, no, I feel more like ascetic actually, so almost the opposite of that. But it was interesting. And then a Greek friend of ours, he said, well, you know, luxury in Greek means polyteleia. Actually, it was you, Maya, I think, no?
It was Eleni.
Oh, it was Eleni. So polyteleia, and polyteleia is something very similar like this consumption, because you have teleia from telos, so you have goals, so there is a striving, a kind of a perfection movement, but many of them. And that is the term luxury. So there is a way to rethink luxuration, which is not driven through an economy of goods, no? Not through consumption, but through consummation. And I am very excited about this because I was struggling now for such a long time that I realized after my passion for Deleuze and then my disgust with object-oriented ontology basically, how can we relate to relations, to topologies, to all these things that we all love today? No, evidently and obviously, because the digital media bring it into a reality that we could not have imagined before. How can we relate to these things in a way that does not cut the means for distinction, does not cut the universal and does not cut the categorical? And this term, polyteleia, helps, I think. And then, wait, what can I show you? Maybe the portico. Maybe the portico in Irigaray. So she describes the portico like this. She says, so this comes after, so she says, the book in which this is introduced is her book entitled The Forgetting of Air in Martin Heidegger. And it's a super relevant book for rethinking the fourfold and the Geviert and the notion of the thing in Heidegger, which is constitutive for so much of contemporary discourses, but not in the way that it seems. She is not saying, I come along and I detect something that Heidegger was blind of. He forgot to think about air. It's not that at all. It's the book. I mean, this is now a bit daring. I only read the first chapters of her book, but I very much hope that it's like that. So she has a portico encounter with Heidegger, where neither she is herself nor is Heidegger himself, but their intellectual projects is kind of consummated in her commentary of his work. So it's not her and him, and she's not criticizing him, but she's giving a substantial, an elemental importance to the element of air, which indeed is missing in Heidegger. No? That's because in Heidegger, for the Geviert, what gives the axis is time, is history. No? So history cannot, so either we have the cyclicity of the weather, the meteora, and then we have the elements and the air, or we have the counted time, no? That produces history. And then we can perhaps say there's a materialist history where we say these counted units, they are of a magnitude. But they are competing, and it's also the case that I think René Descartes was literally the last of this canonic tradition to write treatises on the weather, on the meteora. He was the last one to write a book on it, on the meteora. This is late Baroque, and with Enlightenment, this primacy of history, so first of the encyclopedia, which wants to give rhetorical accounts of knowledge, and then of history, took dominance over the idea of what modern science is, no? And so she is encountering Heidegger. She is not showing his failure or correcting his failure, but she can foreground is only possible in this encounter with Heidegger, because of course it's something feminine, but she as a woman is just as barred from it like Heidegger as a man. So that's the point. And the notion of the portico then comes to be introduced as a substitute or an alternative figure for what in the more ordinary ways of thinking is the bridge. So she says the male thinking wants to acknowledge the other. No? We don't need to say the feminine. Let's just say the other, so what he is not. But it wants to acknowledge it by trying to bridge it, so to build a bridge. And then she says, but how could one build a bridge without saying the other side that needs to be bridged is just like my side here? Because otherwise you don't know where the bridge would meet. You cannot build a bridge. So a bridge doesn't help. And then for that she introduces this notion of the portico. And of this she says, the portico would delimit the passage between two places, even if the place set before is apparently the only one. This delimitation would open indefinitely on a meeting that will never take place. A meeting that will be recounted without taking place, that will take place only in the saying. Its advent is always forefelt, pre-understood, but so as to be preserved and gathered together in the saying. So this introduction of air, or what the complementary of air, also means that speaking becomes like reason and rationality, no? So speaking and writing gets disentangled. It's not that one is an immediate first expression and the other reflects upon it and then preserves it. But there are precisely two poles that cannot be bridged, and yet that relate, so maintain relations with one another that involve networks of relations. So it's not about them alone, it's about the world always. It's not about the self, it's about the world. And the place where this can happen is a place that lives in saying, so in speech, but it will never really that's why it will never take place. No? The speech is gone as soon as it is said. It doesn't stay. Another citation where she describes this, what it would be capable of. This goes closer now to the notion of space as chora. So she writes, this portico would represent everything, or rather, or earlier, it would permit the representation of everything through itself, the framework of that from which she has him and keeps constituting him as a living being, opening to and through this solid body he now is, the body which he received and still receives from her without demonstrations. This portico would be the image of the place of relations, both past and to come, between her and him, the gift of her body in a fluid form, having become, in and through him, that which now stands solidly raised up erected. So you get an idea of how she writes. Now this is her treatment of the Heidegger text. It's not very long, but one takes a lot of time reading it, because one cannot really just read it. It involves an attention which is more contemplative. So one really needs, and that's the beauty, I think, one really needs to figure it out for oneself, but one is guided nevertheless in what can be thought. But it needs to stand on its own in the end. It's not because she says so. No? It doesn't help to say, to quote, but Irigaray in this book argues that, and then say, but one could have this idea or that. It's radically canonic in this sense, not discursive. So it starts to make a canon, to articulate a topic, a theme, which is not a private interest or a particular interest, but is of universal relevancy, but it cannot be owned. That's why it is a canon. And you cannot read this kind of texts without articulating, forming this canon, because the canon is not there. The canon is like this text which you try to translate into another language, but you cannot even read the original one. But it's text, because it's written. So we can say, no, there are so data and information and probabilistics and artificial intelligence, so all these things, they're not nonsense. They're something like a pre-specific common sense. No? They're like the materialization of a thinking that has become common and sedimented, that is not yet articulated in any way. So it's a kind of stuff of architectonics or something such. Yeah, so one way to frame a bit this interest would be, is it possible so there has been a lot of talk against so-called correlationalism. So, and one wants to get rid of the transcendental at large. Or one becomes super dogmatic, no? As a kind of like this new humanist initiative, digital humanism that comes from our school in Vienna, actually. It tries to re-evoke an Enlightenment morality with the notion of the transcendental, but I don't think it's a good idea, because it becomes very tyrannical. But one can flip it, no? So, or at least that's my question. Can one not flip it? So rather than say, so when we are so good now in talking about the conditions of possibilities, which give us reason, general reason, can we not also ask about the possibilities of conditions as a kind of a flowering, so that these possibilities, they're like flowers, they were not necessary. No, they come out of networks of relations that attend to each other in a consummative way, even in nature. So that there is no reason to explain it, but the reason to explain it doesn't help to grasp it. No? So to attend to a notion of experience and phenomena like that, which would be something like an objective aesthetics or so. No? So an aesthetics where one does not identify with the object or the artwork, and where the artwork itself doesn't need to sacrifice the Ascension, no? So the perfection, the movement into the verticality of its movement against the utility. So this is the book Passion élémentaire that she wrote. She also has other titles. This is where she talks about space. So this space is feminine, but her claim is not at all to claim a kind of a priority then to the female. No? So this is never in the social categories of kind of making up for an equality that was there always, but it becomes a genuine philosophical project and interest that promises to relax a lot of things where today's thinking gets very polarized and very agitative. And it's a philosophy of action. And maybe as a last index, then, I mean, if you have, I'm sure it was a bit cryptic, my whole talk, but perhaps there are parts that you were more interested to know more, we can talk a bit. But this index I also want to share, because I started with Deleuze. There is this text which was published by the main Herausgeber, editor of Merve, who founded Merve Verlag in the, I don't remember, I guess late 50s or 60s. And it's a text which Deleuze wrote as letters to Michel Foucault after they had broken. They were good friends. No? Michel Foucault wrote the introductions and the disseminations to help Deleuze's thinking to spread, and the other way around. So they were like portico encounters. No? We can also say what happens in this portico where one is not oneself is what happens in a friendship that is genuine. No? So one kind of shares a project, but one cannot say what the project is. One also doesn't know what attracts that much. It was a friendship, and it broke because at one point for Foucault, everything started to crystallize around the Lust, which is translated as pleasure. Whereas for Deleuze, everything started to crystallize around the notion of desire. And Foucault could not stand desire, and Deleuze could not stand pleasure. And they literally stopped talking and exchanging for many years. And then Deleuze observed how Foucault's work, this is the last works, which in German are translated as Sexuality and Truth, interestingly. But in French, the title is Histories of Sexuality. These four volumes that Foucault wrote, which have to do with a kind of a self-care and the relation to the body and to sexuality and power, obviously, that would go so wrong. So Deleuze observed that which Foucault wants with it is not being heard by anybody. So he wrote these letters, gave it to the editor with the task, would you, if you ever feel the opportunity is right, please give my letters to Michel, because perhaps we can start to talk again. And then Michel Foucault died before he received it, I believe. So this exchange never took place. But these letters are, when I think of a portico encounter, apart from Irigaray's own engagement with Heidegger, this is what I would think of. It is a gesture of a selflessness that is totally, if you want, in the ideality of subject centrism, but it's not about one's individual. So it's an exchange and a meeting of a project that is not graspable for anyone alone, but in which one has believed one's whole life to be participating somehow. So it's we've had the interest in letter writing earlier in several of your projects, and I really think there is something to it with this letter writing. It's also the case that the letter writing formed in this, so in pre-modern times, so before discourses, that came with the printing mainly, no? So yeah, in Enlightenment, so the easy and cheap and fast production of books and leaflets and pamphlets and so on. Letter writing was an essential part of the development of the exchange of the people. That's why almost everybody, and this still applied to the early 20th century, who was intellectually ambitious in whichever field would always know the state of the art, more or less, of all the other fields as well. And know of them does not mean be an expert in that and be able to practice it, but they would know what are the obstacles that are challenging the community right now. What are they trying to accommodate? What are they trying to reinvent themselves around? One doesn't need to understand in order to gain a familiarity with these things. And then this allowed an exchange that we really capture not well when we today want to do multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary and all these kind of helpless bridging attempts, which always produce sterility, no? And reproduction, more of the same. So I think there is a great interest in these things, and I like the idea to think of them as flowers. And the flowers, so that's maybe a last anecdote, that's where this picture is coming from. It's we had a meeting with all our peers, all the professors from our faculty, always go for a dinner before the summer, and then my colleague said, so we talked about what was the oddest lecture that you gave this year, and then my colleague said, the oddest lecture, she's a regional planner, The oldest lecture was in some village outside of Vienna, where just before her, a biologist who studies these snails gave a talk. And this talk was half an hour just about the mating behavior of these snails, because they're not snails normal, they're called, I forgot it again, Schneegel, they're called Schneegel. Schneegel, they're super large, they're like naked snails, but they can be very large, and they live in grottos where it's wet. And they reproduce in ways which, so their genitals by far exceed the body size of them, and they come out and they're luminescent in the dark. And their genitals provides the place where they can hold each other in the mating procedure. And this in 1,000 different ways. And then, so she would talk about the regional plans of a certain area in rural, somewhere near Vienna. After half an hour seeing pictures of this kind of action by a super dry biologist who, since, I don't know, 15 years specializes on the life behavior in the grottos of these snails. And she said this was the oddest situation ever to start talking about what she wants to engage with. But what I find interesting, apart for the anecdote, of course, is that there is a notion, or can there not be a notion of thinking of technology or techniques as a prosthesis, where the prosthesis would not be mimetical but pantomimetical, no? So a kind of in a pantomime must be sad, because he can only mime everything if he mourns the world. So I never understood why does there need to be a sad clown? I think I get a lot more of it now. No? But then this mourning it's not a giving in, it's not a celebration of the melancholia. One is stepping on ground there. One is not drowning in the abyss, but the abyss can be there somehow as a source. Yeah, that's a bit of a Luce. But speaking of a source, not this one, there is a man sitting on the fountain. With this image I want to play. This one. Because that was another part in Irigaray that puzzled me a lot. So she would totally, that's why, so the feminine is nature, but nature is not a source. So it's not this idea that nature would be a free source, but then it's appropriated. But no, so this feminine, or it's the space, it's the limited. And her interest is to say the wealth and the abundance of everything that blooms in nature or that comes out of nature only comes out because it's limited. So it's totally wrong or only the male gaze attends to the feminine or to nature as a source, because you can then administrate it, no? If you do that. And I found this very striking as well when I saw it. And this again, so that's important with her. She is not a generation of social scientists that are in gender studies today. This is so her project is a metaphysical one. She never attacks the behaviors of men versus the ones of women. It's really not the point. It's about allowing to think differently of these big topics, no, which come now around the corner everywhere, with saving the world and recycling, cyclic economy, and everywhere. No? So the linearity cannot help us. We need to think cyclically, but how? Without rendering a continuity. Yeah, this was my bouquet. Thanks.